Ever get that feeling? You know, like history class kind of glossed over some things, like maybe missed a chapter or two. Well, today we're diving deep into one of those often overlooked stories. One even called, get this, the Forgotten War.
Yeah.
The Korean War. And you're here with us because you want more than just the surface level, right?
Well, absolutely.
We're going beyond the who, what, when, where. We're getting into the why this conflict matters, not just for Korea, but for the whole world.
Right, the global impact.
Exactly. And buckle up, because what makes this war so fascinating is how it all began. It's almost like a domino effect.
Interesting you should put it that way.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because you see all these decisions seemingly small at the time.
Right.
But each one leading to the next, ultimately with huge, huge consequences.
Okay, so rewind with me to 1945. World War II's just ended. You'd think Korea, occupied by Japan for decades, would finally be free to, to be their own unified country, celebrate that liberation.
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah. But instead, things took a pretty sharp turn, didn't they?
They did indeed. Instead of a unified Korea, what we see is the beginning, the seeds of future conflict being sown. You see, the Allied powers, instead of presenting, a united front for Korea's future,
Right.
they decide to divide the Korean peninsula.
And they divide it right along the 38th parallel. And that's not really based on, any natural landmarks or anything, is it?
No.
It's more like someone just grabbed a ruler and drew a line straight through a country.
A rather arbitrary line, you could say. Chosen, and this is important, chosen for logistical reasons by the Allies. They weren't really thinking about Korea's history, the social fabric of the nation.
Wow.
And so this division creates two Koreas. North Korea, under the communist leadership of Kim Il-sung, supported by the Soviet Union, and South Korea, with U.S. backing, leaning towards capitalism.
So Korea, a country with centuries of shared history, just cleaved into practically overnight. I mean, can you imagine the confusion, the fear that must have caused for Korean families? Suddenly they're on opposite sides of this new divide.
It was a chaotic time.
Yeah, I bet. And it seems like this division it set the stage for this tense standoff. Was war inevitable at that point, or were there other things at play?
Well, the division definitely created, let's call it a powder keg situation.
Yeah.
But Kim Il-sung's ambition was a major factor. This is a man who desired a unified Korea, but under his communist rule. And it was this desire that led him to seek Stalin's support in 1949.
So Kim Il-sung saw an opportunity in this divided Korea, but he needed someone powerful on his side. And he gets the backing of the Soviet Union, of Stalin himself. That's huge. Did Stalin's support directly lead to war, though?
It's not like Stalin gave the order to invade, if that's what you mean. It didn't immediately put troops on the ground.
Okay.
But it was a turning point. Stalin's approval, it emboldened Kim Il-sung.
Right.
Gave him the confidence, and perhaps even the feeling of having a safety net to really push for his goals more aggressively.
It's kind of chilling how a decision made thousands of miles away in the Kremlin could have such a massive impact on a country like Korea. Really shows the power dynamics at play during the Cold War.
Absolutely. The world was a very different place back then.
So here we are, Korea, divided. A young nation caught in this global tug of war. That's the Cold War, right? And at the helm, you've got this leader with these big ambitions for unification. What happens next?
Well, June 25th, 1950, a date etched in history. That's when North Korea, in a surprise attack,
Wow.
unleashes its forces across the 38th parallel.
Just like that.
Just like that. South Korea and its allies are completely caught off guard.
It's one thing to want to unify your country. It's another thing entirely to launch a full-on invasion. That just seems like a huge escalation. What was the reaction like? I mean, internationally?
The world was shocked. South Korea was just not prepared for an attack like that, so naturally they struggled to hold ground.
Yeah.
And the United States, they saw this invasion as a power grab by the Soviet Union, a way to spread their communist influence. They felt they had to do something.
Okay, so this conflict in Korea becomes this proxy war, part of this much bigger fight between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Exactly. And the United States, at this time, they had a lot of influence in the newly formed United Nations.
Right.
And so they rallied the UN to support South Korea. The UN Security Council,
Okay.
with the Soviet Union notably absent, mind you.
Oh, interesting.
They couldn't veto.
Yeah.
They authorized military intervention.
Wow, so this is a major turning point, right? This is the first time that the UN would use actual military force to intervene in a conflict.
It's a historic moment, no doubt. It set a precedent for future interventions and really solidified the UN's role in global security matters.
Right.
The Korean War, it became this testing ground for the UN's mission of international peace and security. And the U.S., leading the UN forces, they found themselves in this conflict, this war, thousands of miles away from home.
Yeah.
A conflict that would have really lasting consequences, we now know.
It's just incredible how something that began as this internal struggle, this desire to unify one nation, could so quickly become this international crisis. So the U.S. and its allies, they get involved. Does that turn the tide of the war?
Well, initially, the North Korean forces, they actually made significant gains, pushing deep into South Korea.
Oh, wow.
But the U.S., under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, they orchestrated this daring counteroffensive. The Incheon landing.
Oh, yeah, the Incheon landing. That was huge. I mean, landing troops behind enemy lines, that seems incredibly risky.
It was a gamble, absolutely. A strategic masterpiece, yes, but one that could have backfired spectacularly.
Right.
Incheon itself, geographically, it's a nightmare. You've got difficult tides, narrow channels, a logistical nightmare. But it worked. And it really did prove to be a turning point in the war.
So what happened? How did the Incheon landing change things on the ground?
Complete surprise.
Really?
The North Korean forces, they had no idea it was coming. It cut off their supply lines, forced them to retreat, and allowed the UN and South Korean forces to recapture Seoul and regain lost ground.
So for a moment, it seemed like victory was within reach.
It did. It really did. But, and there's always a but, isn't there?
Right.
The Korean War was far, far from over.
There's more to this story. A twist, maybe?
You could say that. You see, as the UN forces, they're advancing northward, they get close to the Yalu River, the border of China. And that's when a new player enters the scene.
So UN forces pushing north, feeling good after Incheon, and then bam, China.
It's one thing to want to unify your peninsula. It's another to have a global superpower suddenly right there on your border. Can't say I blame them for being a little edgy.
Right, that's got to be unnerving, having a foreign army on your doorstep like that. So how did China react? What'd they do?
Well, they weren't messing around. October 1950, Chinese forces, we're talking huge numbers here, they crossed that Yalu River. They're officially in the Korean War.
Wow, so it's not even just Korea anymore. It's like this proxy battleground for this huge ideological war between, well, everybody.
And this wasn't just a show of force, oh no. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops, they launched this massive counteroffensive. UN forces, they were not expecting that, let me tell you. Completely changes the game.
So the U.S., they miscalculated, underestimated China's commitment to keeping that conflict, keeping it far away from their own backyard.
Big miscalculation. And the fallout from that, it wasn't just on the battlefield. Back home in the U.S., it fueled the Red Scare, that paranoia about communists infiltrating everything, suspicion, fear, the whole 9 yards, and internationally. Man, it just dug that trench deeper between the communist East and the capitalist West. Set the stage for more of these proxy wars, Vietnam being the big one. The Korean War, it's like a microcosm of all the anxieties and tension of the entire Cold War era.
Crazy. So the war keeps dragging on with China now in the mix. What happens next?
Stalemate. Brutal, bloody stalemate. Those sweeping advances, those daring maneuvers like Incheon, gone. Now it's a war of attrition. Trenches. Just like the worst of World War I.
It's easy to forget when we talk about these big ideas, communism versus capitalism dividing up the world, that it's the soldiers down in those trenches who pay the price. Awful. So how does the stalemate finally end?
It takes years of fighting, devastating losses on all sides. Finally, July 1953, they get an armistice.
Armistice, not a peace treaty.
Nope. The fighting stopped, but the war, technically, it never officially ended. Frozen in time is what it is.
Yeah.
Two Koreas, still technically at war, separated by that heavily fortified demilitarized zone, the DMZ, which, by the way, still pretty much follows that original, totally arbitrary line someone drew on a map way back when.
The more things change. So the DMZ, that's like a scar, isn't it? A physical reminder of this unfinished business, this conflict, just frozen.
And the two Koreas, they come out of this war on completely different trajectories. South Korea, they get a lot of help, the US and others, and they build themselves into this economic powerhouse. Thriving democracy, vibrant culture. North Korea, Kim Il-sung, his successors, they clamp down. Isolation, military might, nuclear ambitions. Night and day, really.
The ripple effects, right? One war, but it shapes the future in ways you can't even predict at the time.
Exactly. The Korean War, it's a lesson. It's about the consequences, often tragic, of these big global power struggles playing out on a smaller stage. And it reminds us, A conflict, even if it seems contained, it can have these massive, far-reaching implications.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all this?
Remember this: decisions, even ones that seem small, made in some far-off place, they can have huge consequences. Dividing Korea, one leader's ambition, those miscalculations by global superpowers, it all came together, sparked this conflict that still shapes the world today. So the next time you're trying to make sense of what's happening in the world, think back to the Korean War. It's a reminder that history matters. It's not just dates and names in a textbook. It's got something to teach us.
It's a story that, unfortunately, we keep seeing echoes of today.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.